Hi there folks, and welcome back to my Camera Basics series. This is where I go through all the key essential factors of how a camera works and photography in general, and how we can get the most out of your camera to help improve your photography. In episode 1 we covered light and exposure, which is the very foundation of how a photograph is created. And then in episode 2 we covered shutter speed and how that can affect your images. This today is episode 3, where we are covering ISO. If you've not already seen the previous videos, I'll leave a link up here as well as in the description down below. So by all means, take the time to check those out first and we'll wait. Okay, so ISO. ISO stands for International Standardization Organization, which you don't really need to know. What you do need to know is what ISO represents. ISO is much the same as ASA back in the days of film photography. Now, ASA stands for American Standards Association. Yeah, another organisation. Basically, these guys were responsible for setting the standard values of the film speed sensitivity of photographic emulsions. Film. Since digital photography became a thing, they were basically replaced by the International Standardization Organization, but they pretty much do exactly the same thing, only for digital sensors. So in short, both ISO and ASA mean exactly the same thing. It represents how sensitive either a photographic sensor or photographic film is to light. The global standard across the majority of digital sensors is ISO 100, with exception of Micro Four Thirds cameras where they'll usually set the base at ISO 200. Again, exactly the same as shutter speed and light itself, ISO is measured in stops. Using ISO 100 as our base value, if we wanted to increase that by one stop, we would have to double it to give us ISO 200. And then the same again, if we wanted to add another stop to ISO 200, we double it to ISO 400, then 800, 1600, 3200, etc, etc. The higher the ISO value, the more sensitive a sensor is to light, and vice versa. The lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light. An easy way to think of ISO is almost as artificial light for your camera. Your use of ISO should depend entirely on your photographic conditions, i.e. the available light to you. So for example, if you're shooting outside on a nice sunny day, you should be absolutely fine with ISO 100. Because there's plenty of light around, you don't need to help the sensor out with adding that artificial light. Now imagine that you're still outside, but the clouds roll in. You now have an overcast scene where a lot of that sunlight has been diffused by the cloud. You can help the camera out by increasing your ISO by 1 or 2 stops, which will probably give you roughly the same shutter speed and aperture to work with. When you're shooting indoors, as I am here, there's usually very little light to play with. So this is an occasion where you might need to boost that ISO up to 800, 1600, possibly even further. If you relied on shutter speed to expose your images, you could soon start running into problems, especially in lower light conditions, mainly in the form of motion blur. Boosting that ISO can help reduce the risk of motion blur by adding that light and giving you a faster shutter speed. ISO is a really important factor to remember, especially in the case of indoor sporting events. Those big bright floodlights might seem really bright, but in reality they're not at all. It's still a very dark situation and you have very fast moving subjects. As we mentioned in the last episode on shutter speed, if you're looking to shoot moving subjects, you're probably going to want a very fast shutter speed, roughly around 1/2000th of a second. If you were still using ISO 100, this would probably give you a very dark, underexposed image. So by boosting up that ISO, you're able to compensate by adding more light and giving yourself a correct exposure. Now, the one downside with ISO is noise. This is very much like the grain that you'd find in higher speed photographic film. Generally speaking, the higher the ISO or ASA, the grainier or noisier your image is going to look. This is something that you need to keep an eye on, And my suggestion would be, when you get a new camera, test it out at different ISO levels to see where the threshold is. How far can you push the ISO before you get an unacceptable amount of noise in your images? In recent years, sensor technology has come on leaps and bounds, and we can shoot at much higher ISO values than we used to be able to, and still very often getting pleasing results. For example, I shoot on a pair of Sony A7 IIIs, which have superb low light ability. On the A7 III, I can comfortably shoot at 12,000 plus ISO and still get very usable images. For comparison, I used to shoot on the Lumix G9, and I would never want to push the ISO on that any further than 3200. That's not necessarily because it's an older sensor, but also because of the fact it's a smaller sensor. But we're not going to go into that in great depth today. Like I say, whatever camera you're using, do your own tests. Take a series of images of the same scene, increasing your ISO value each time, and just find that maximum value that you're happy shooting at. The A7 III can shoot well beyond 100,000 ISO, but that doesn't mean that I should. Much like any other part of photography, this noise or grain is totally subjective. If passing that threshold that you found on your camera is the difference between getting the shot and not getting the shot, then I would always rather get the shot and have that little extra noise. In editing software these days, such as Lightroom or Capture One, you can do a lot of work to remove that noise in your images, so there is that bit of room to play with. But saying that, it is always nicer not to have to go through that process and have a nice image to begin with. And that is pretty much it on ISO. I do hope that you've enjoyed this video as well as learnt from this video. In the next video, we'll be talking about the third and final aspect of the exposure triangle, which is aperture. What it is, how it works, and how it affects your images. So if you enjoyed this video, I do look forward to seeing you in the next one. Please do consider hitting the subscribe button down in the bottom corner there, as well as the notification bell. Do be sure to give it a like if you liked it, and if you have any questions at all, just leave them in the comments down below and I'll be sure to answer them. Or if you like, you can even drop me an email or a message on Instagram, and I'm always happy to answer. So until next time, be good, get out there with your camera, practicing what you're learning, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.